This source examines the Guadalcanal campaign, the first major offensive operation carried out by the United States against Japan during World War II. The narrative highlights the failure of Japanese military ideology, which had long relied on the belief that the spirit and determination of the imperial soldier could overcome any opponent. On Guadalcanal, however, this belief collided with the overwhelming industrial capacity and organized supply system of the United States. Fighting on the island took place in extremely harsh jungle conditions. Disease, hunger, and exhaustion became constant enemies of the Japanese troops. In many cases, these factors caused more losses than direct combat with American forces. A key element of the campaign was the struggle for control of Henderson Field, an airstrip whose possession gave American forces a crucial advantage. From this base, U.S. aircraft were able to control the surrounding skies and threaten Japanese ships attempting to deliver reinforcements. The outcome of the battle proved to be a turning point in the Pacific War. The fighting undermined the image of the invincible Japanese soldier and allowed the Allied forces to take the strategic initiative. For many Japanese veterans, Guadalcanal became a shocking experience. They faced an enemy whose firepower, resources, and logistical support were far greater than anything they had previously encountered. From this moment on, Japan's path in the Pacific War increasingly moved toward eventual defeat.
Why did the Japanese doctrine of spiritual strength lose to American logistics on Guadalcanal? Japan's doctrine of spiritual strength collapsed on Guadalcanal when it faced the systematic application of American industrial power, logistics, and overwhelming firepower. The campaign became a clash between two fundamentally different approaches to modern warfare. Japanese commanders believed that courage, fighting spirit, and aggressive tactics could compensate for material shortages. The United States, however, relied on logistics and firepower as the main multipliers of military strength. The essence of the Japanese doctrine and the command's miscalculation. Japanese leadership placed its faith in the superiority of spiritual strength, aggressive night assaults, and the willingness of soldiers to engage in close combat. Many Japanese veterans believed that American troops were softened by comfort, poorly trained, lacking discipline, and unable to withstand the determination of imperial soldiers. According to this doctrine, bold attacks and a willingness to die would break the enemy's firepower. In reality, these traditional assaults repeatedly collided with prepared American defensive zones. Japanese infantry suffered devastating losses under carefully coordinated crossfire from artillery and machine guns. The American logistical triumph versus the Japanese Tokyo Express. The main reason for Japan's defeat was the enormous difference between the two supply systems. American logistics. The United States developed an efficient system of industrial warfare. During the day, under the protection of aircraft operating from Henderson Field, transport ships regularly delivered food, ammunition, modern equipment, and medical supplies. Supplies were so abundant that machine gunners could fire continuously until their barrels wore out, knowing replacements would arrive without difficulty. U.S. Marines had field hospitals with surgical capabilities, blood plasma for transfusions, and essential medicines. Japanese logistical collapse. Because the Americans controlled the skies during daylight hours, Japanese forces were forced to deliver reinforcements only at night using fast destroyers. This method became known as the Tokyo Express. While it allowed troops to be transported secretly, destroyers could not carry heavy equipment, artillery, or, most importantly, sufficient food and ammunition. Soldiers arrived on the island carrying only what they could bring with them. Catastrophic consequences for the Japanese army. The harsh logistical reality doomed Japanese attempts to retake the island. Soldiers were forced to fight not only American forces, but also extreme exhaustion and starvation. Food shortages reduced rations to a single rice ball per day. By the end of the campaign, desperate soldiers tried to survive by eating grass and tree bark. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Quinine quickly ran out, allowing malaria, dysentery, and tropical diseases to devastate the army. By late October, more than 60% of the soldiers of Japan's 17th Army were no longer combat capable due to illness and malnutrition. Severely wounded soldiers were often left with a grenade so they could take their own lives rather than slow down their units. Out of the 25,000 to 30,000 Japanese soldiers who died on Guadalcanal, an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 perished not from bullets, but from disease and starvation. The collapse of illusions. For the Japanese soldiers who survived, Guadalcanal became the moment when harsh reality shattered pre-war illusions. They realized that their training and tactics had been designed for a completely different kind of war.
Personal bravery and sacrifice proved meaningless against an enemy whose supplies never ran out, whose wounded received medical care, whose artillery could fire continuously, and whose industry replaced losses faster than they could be inflicted. The Americans ultimately prevailed because they fought as coordinated systems of logistics, firepower, and industrial strength, while the Japanese simply did not possess such systems.
Why did the Japanese doctrine of spiritual strength lose to American logistics on Guadalcanal? Japan's doctrine of spiritual strength collapsed on Guadalcanal when it faced the systematic application of American industrial power, logistics, and overwhelming firepower. The campaign became a clash between two fundamentally different approaches to modern warfare. Japanese commanders believed that courage, fighting spirit, and aggressive tactics could compensate for material shortages. The United States, however, relied on logistics and firepower as the main multipliers of military strength. The essence of the Japanese doctrine and the command's miscalculation. Japanese leadership placed its faith in the superiority of spiritual strength, aggressive night assaults, and the willingness of soldiers to engage in close combat. Many Japanese veterans believed that American troops were softened by comfort, poorly trained, lacking discipline, and unable to withstand the determination of imperial soldiers. According to this doctrine, bold attacks and a willingness to die would break the enemy's firepower. In reality, these traditional assaults repeatedly collided with prepared American defensive zones. Japanese infantry suffered devastating losses under carefully coordinated crossfire from artillery and machine guns.
Misjudging industrial warfare. Japanese intelligence also failed to fully grasp the scale of American industrial strength. Many Japanese planners did not anticipate the kind of war they were entering, a conflict where logistics, production, and coordinated systems of warfare would determine the outcome. The United States relied on a powerful network of supply lines, medical support, and close coordination between infantry, artillery, naval forces, and air power. It was only after the brutal fighting on Guadalcanal that many Japanese soldiers and officers began to understand how wrong their assumptions had been. They realized that American forces were not weak or inexperienced, but well-equipped, highly organized opponents, capable of enduring the harsh conditions of jungle warfare and systematically defeating their enemy.
Why did Japanese forces continue launching attacks despite suffering extremely heavy losses? Japanese forces continued launching repeated and often suicidal attacks because of a combination of strategic pressure, deep faith in their military doctrine, and an inability to adjust to the changing reality of the war. Strategic importance of Henderson Field. Japanese commanders quickly realized that Henderson Field was the key to the entire campaign. During the day, American aircraft operating from this airfield controlled the surrounding seas and could destroy Japanese ships within hundreds of miles. Because of this, Japanese leadership believed the airfield had to be captured as quickly as possible before American forces could fully strengthen their defenses. This urgency pushed Japanese troops into rapid and desperate assaults. Unshakable belief in spiritual strength. Japanese tactics relied heavily on morale, aggressive action, and night attacks intended to overwhelm the enemy. Many commanders believed that courage, determination, and close combat tactics could overcome superior firepower. Even when waves of soldiers were cut down by American machine guns and artillery, officers continued to believe that American troops would eventually lose their nerve under relentless attacks. Failure to adapt to new conditions of war. Japanese military culture was shaped by years of victories and long-standing traditions. Because of this, the leadership struggled to accept that their approach to warfare might be outdated. Instead of recognizing that tactics effective in China would fail against a powerful industrial nation like the United States, commanders often blamed defeats on supply problems or temporary setbacks, repeating the same attack patterns again and again. A culture of absolute sacrifice. Japanese soldiers were trained to accept death and fight to the very end. Surrender was considered dishonorable and almost unthinkable. Out of roughly 36,000 Japanese soldiers who fought on Guadalcanal, fewer than 1,000 were taken prisoner, and most of them were too severely wounded or ill to continue fighting. Their willingness to attack despite hopeless odds and to die rather than retreat impressed and sometimes shocked the American troops who faced them.
Japanese commanders managed to evacuate their remaining troops from Guadalcanal through a carefully organized night naval operation known as Operation K. By December 1942, Japanese leadership based in Rabaul had realized that continuing the campaign would only lead to the complete destruction of the 17th Army. Of the roughly 36,000 soldiers who had been sent to the island, only about 11,000 were still alive. Even among those survivors, only around 7,000 were physically capable of marching and fighting. The rest were severely weakened by starvation, illness, and wounds, and many could barely move. To rescue the remaining troops, the Japanese Navy used a strategy similar to the well-known Tokyo Express. Fast destroyers were the key to the evacuation. These warships were able to move quickly through the dangerous waters around Guadalcanal. The entire operation was carried out only at night, which was crucial for its success. During the day, American aircraft operating from Henderson Field dominated the skies and would have quickly destroyed any Japanese ships they detected. Speed was also essential. The evacuation took place over just 3 nights at the beginning of February 1943. Japanese destroyers rushed to the island, loaded thousands of exhausted soldiers, and quickly withdrew before daylight. In total, these daring night operations allowed the Japanese Navy to evacuate 10,652 soldiers from Guadalcanal. Although Japan had suffered a major defeat in the overall campaign, the evacuation itself is often considered one of the most successful Japanese naval operations of the war, especially given the extremely difficult conditions under which it was carried out. The nighttime evacuation of Japanese troops from Guadalcanal, known as Operation K, was carried out by the Imperial Japanese Navy and became one of Japan's most successful operations of the war, despite the overall disaster of the campaign. The decision to withdraw was made by Japanese commanders in Rabaul in December 1942, when it became clear that continuing the battle would only lead to the complete destruction of the Japanese 17th Army. The condition of the troops. By the time the evacuation began, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were in extremely poor condition. Out of the roughly 36,000 soldiers who had passed through the island during the campaign, only about 11,000 remained alive.
Of those survivors, only around 7,000 were still physically capable of walking and fighting. The rest were wounded, seriously ill, or so weakened by starvation that many could barely move. Tactics and execution of the operation. To rescue the remaining troops, the Japanese Navy used a tactic similar to the famous Tokyo Express, which had previously been used to secretly deliver reinforcements to the island. Fast destroyers played the central role. These warships made rapid nighttime runs to Guadalcanal, loading exhausted soldiers and quickly departing before daylight. Speed and secrecy were critical. The entire evacuation was carried out over just 3 nights in early February 1943. Operating under the cover of darkness allowed the Japanese ships to avoid American aircraft, which dominated the skies during the day from Henderson Field. The outcome. Through these coordinated night missions, the Japanese Navy successfully evacuated 10,652 soldiers from Guadalcanal. On February 9, 1943, American patrols discovered that Japanese forces had abandoned their positions. General Alexander Patch then sent a famous message to Admiral William Halsey, stating, "The Tokyo Express no longer has a terminus on Guadalcanal." The aftermath. The evacuated soldiers were not sent home. Instead, they were reassigned to other Japanese units across the Pacific theater of war. Many of them carried with them the heavy psychological burden of defeat, as well as the bitter realization that American forces were far stronger and better supplied than Japanese propaganda had once claimed.